Welcome to The Deep Dive, the podcast where we sweat the small stuff so you don't have to. From real stories to expert advice, we're here to uncover everything about hyperhidrosis and empower you to take control. Ready to dive into the world of sweat and solutions? Let's make a splash.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Definitely.
Awesome. Today we're tackling a topic that's close to some of your hearts, I know, because you guys sent in some questions about it. It's about sweat, specifically in Kenya. We found this really interesting video from Hyperhidrosis Awareness Kenya. And, well, I learned a lot. I don't know about you.
Yeah, me too. I think it's fascinating to see how these kinds of issues are handled in different parts of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that really jumped out at me right off the bat was this idea that Kenya, at least as of when this video was made, doesn't have like a dedicated sweat clinic.
Right. And I think that kind of gets to the heart of a lot of the challenges that people with conditions like hyperhidrosis face.
Like you think of if you have a heart problem, you go to a cardiologist. If you have a problem with your stomach, you go to a gastroenterologist. But with sweat, it's like, where do you even go?
Yeah, and it's interesting because dermatologists are technically, the specialists for sweat issues.
Makes sense, right? It's on your skin.
Yeah, exactly. It manifests on the skin, so it falls under their domain. But the way the system is set up, it doesn't really allow for the kind of in-depth care that, something like hyperhidrosis might require.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. Like when you go to the dermatologist, I mean, sometimes you're in and out in like 15 minutes, right? Other times you're there for like an hour. Like how much can you really unpack in 10, 15 minutes?
Right, exactly. And, you've got paperwork, you've got, just the initial conversation, and then the dermatologist has to kind of make a diagnosis, potentially recommend treatment options, all within that, short time frame.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a theme that we see throughout this video is that lack of kind of specialized care and also just awareness.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's not just about the lack of dedicated clinics. It's also about the fact that dermatology as a field encompasses such a wide range of conditions.
Right.
So you've got everything from, minor rashes to, skin cancer to, complex sweat disorders, all kind of lumped together.
So it's like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a good analogy. It's like going to the mechanic and they're like, yeah, I can fix your flat tire, but I can also rebuild your engine. It's like, well, those are two very different skill sets, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think, it's not to say that dermatologists aren't capable of handling sweat issues, but, when you have such a wide range of things that you're dealing with, it's hard to become an expert in everything.
Yeah. And the video even mentions, there's this quote from a senior dermatologist who says that, a lot of his colleagues lack that kind of deep knowledge of hyperhidrosis.
Right. And that's where I think an organization like Hyperhidrosis Awareness Kenya really steps in and fills that gap.
It makes me think, if you go to a dermatologist and they're like, well, there's really not much we can do. But then you go to Hyperhidrosis Awareness Kenya and they're like, actually, there are all these different options. That must be so validating for people.
Yeah, I can only imagine. And that's why it's so important to have these kinds of patient advocacy groups.
Definitely. So, we've been talking about kind of the system level issues, the lack of, dedicated clinics and all of that. But what about the actual diagnostic process? Like if someone goes to a doctor with a sweat issue, how does that typically go?
Well, I think one of the things that the video highlights is that, a lot of those tend to focus on what we call secondary causes of sweating. So things like thyroid issues, infections, certain medications.
Yeah, okay.
They might jump to those explanations without fully considering primary hyperhidrosis.
And primary hyperhidrosis being?
Primary hyperhidrosis means that the excessive sweating is the primary condition, not a symptom of something else. There's no underlying medical cause.
Oh, okay. So it's like the headache that's not from you bumping your head. It's just that's the problem.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so I see how that would be a problem then if you're, if the doctor's not considering that as a possibility.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that Hyperhidrosis Awareness Kenya does differently is they really dig into the family history.
Oh, interesting. They ask about that.
Yeah, they ask about family history of sweating, even if it's in different body areas than what the person is experiencing.
So like even if you're just having sweaty palms, they might ask about, if your mom had sweaty armpits or something.
Exactly.
Why would that be important?
Well, it's all about understanding, if there's a genetic component.
Oh, okay.
And genetics, might only account for a small percentage of cases, but it's still a factor to consider.
It's like, I don't know, if your family has a history of high blood pressure, that doesn't mean they're going to get it, but it's something your doctor should know.
Right, exactly.
So it's kind of like a clue, maybe?
Yeah, exactly. Just another piece of the puzzle.
Interesting. So Hyperhidrosis Awareness Kenya really seems to be taking this kind of more holistic approach,
Yeah.
Looking at all the different factors.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're not just, providing information, they're also actively trying to change the landscape of sweat disorder treatment in Kenya.
How so?
Well, one of the things that they're doing is they're empowering patients to advocate for themselves.
Okay.
So they're giving them the knowledge and resources to be able to have informed conversations with their doctors.
So it's not just, oh, I'm sweaty. It's, I have hyperhidrosis. These are the things I've learned.
Exactly. And then on the other hand, they're working to educate doctors.
Oh, interesting.
So they're trying to bridge that knowledge gap, by offering resources and training to make sure that doctors feel confident in their ability to, diagnose and treat sweat disorders.
Wow. So it's really a two-pronged approach there. They're working with the patients and the doctors.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, that's really cool. But I mean, we can't really talk about healthcare without talking about insurance, right? Like, how does that play into all of this?
Yeah, that's a great point. And unfortunately, a lot of insurance companies in Kenya don't recognize excessive sweating as a medical condition that warrants coverage.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah, and so that creates a huge barrier for, people who are seeking treatment, especially, some of the more expensive treatments that might be available.
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of people, it's not just a matter of convenience, right? It's impacting their quality of life.
Right, exactly. It could be, very debilitating in some cases.
So what are they doing to kind of tackle that challenge?
Well, they're actually actively engaging with insurance providers. So they're pushing for policy changes that would recognize hyperhidrosis as a legitimate medical concern requiring coverage.
Wow, that's a big undertaking.
It is, but they're determined to make a difference. They're gathering data, they're sharing patient stories. They're really trying to demonstrate the impact that these conditions have on people's lives.
It makes you wonder, like what would a healthcare system that's truly inclusive and, supportive for people with sweat disorders, what would that look like?
Right. That's a great question and something to really think about. I think at a minimum, there needs to be greater recognition of these conditions as legitimate medical concerns. And that includes, training for healthcare providers, resources that are readily available for patients and insurance policies that cover, the cost of diagnosis for treatment.
Definitely. All right. Well, I feel like we've just scratched the surface here. I mean, there's so much more to unpack, but I think this is a good starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so important to keep in mind that, behind the statistics and the policy discussions and all of that, there are real people whose lives are deeply affected by these conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe we can dig into some of those personal stories in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah, I think that would be great.
All right. We'll be right back after a quick break.
We've been talking a lot about the healthcare system and insurance and all that.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to remember that there's a whole other side to this, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not just about, getting the right diagnosis or the right treatment. It's about the social and emotional impact of living with these conditions.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we often overlook. When we're talking about healthcare, we tend to focus on the physical symptoms.
Right.
But, for someone with hyperhidrosis, it's not just about the sweat.
Right.
It's about what that sweat represents, It's about the anxiety, the embarrassment, the feeling of being different.
Exactly. And just imagine, think about all the things we take for granted.
Yeah.
Like shaking someone's hand or holding a pen or wearing certain types of clothing.
Yeah, or giving someone a hug.
Right. Exactly. And for someone with severe hyperhidrosis, those everyday actions can become a source of real anxiety and embarrassment.
Yeah, it's almost like having a secret that you're constantly trying to hide.
Right, exactly.
And you're worried about people noticing, and you're worried about sweat stains, and it can really take a toll on your self-esteem and your social interactions.
Absolutely. And that's where I think, organizations like Hyperhidrosis Awareness Kenya, they really they really get that. They understand that it's not just about, providing medical treatment.
Yeah.
It's about providing a sense of community and understanding and support.
Yeah, it's about creating a space where people feel seen and heard and understood.
Exactly. And that can be so empowering for people.
Yeah.
Just to realize that they're not alone in this. There are other people who are going through the same thing.
And it's not their fault.
Right, exactly.
It's not something that they can just, snap their fingers and fix. So we've talked about kind of the emotional and social side of things, but I'm also curious about, how Hyperhidrosis Awareness Kenya is actually advocating for change.
Right.
Like, what are some of their strategies?
Well, I think they have a really multi-pronged approach.
Okay.
They focus on education, awareness, and policy change. So on the education front, they provide a ton of information on their website.
Yeah.
They do community outreach programs.
Okay.
They're really trying to empower patients to understand their condition, to learn about potential treatments, and to advocate for themselves within the healthcare system.
That's so important, because knowledge is power, right?
Absolutely.
The more you understand about what you're dealing with, the better equipped you are to navigate all of this.
Exactly. And then on the awareness front, they're really trying to break down the stigma associated with sweat disorders.
Yeah, because there's a lot of shame around it.
Oh, absolutely. There's this idea that it's just a matter of hygiene, or that it's a lack of willpower,
right?
Or that people should just get over it.
Yeah.
But they're really trying to emphasize that this is a medical condition, oftentimes with a genetic component.
Yeah.
That deserves recognition and treatment.
It's about changing the narrative, right?
Exactly.
It's about shifting the conversation from shame and secrecy to understanding and support.
Absolutely.
Because, when we break down those stigmas, people feel more comfortable coming forward, seeking help and sharing their experiences.
Exactly. And this kind of leads into their efforts on policy change. We talked earlier about the challenges with insurance coverage.
Right.
And they're actually, lobbying insurance providers to recognize extensive sweating as a medical condition that warrants coverage.
Wow, that's a big undertaking, to try to change those policies.
It is, but they're making progress.
Yeah,
they're gathering data. They're sharing patient stories. They're really trying to demonstrate the impact that these conditions have on people's lives.
It makes you wonder, like, what would a healthcare system that's truly inclusive and supportive for people with sweat disorders, what would that look like?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And I think, at the very least, there needs to be, greater recognition of these conditions as legitimate medical concerns. That includes, training for healthcare providers, resources that are readily available for patients, and insurance policies that cover the cost of diagnosis and treatment.
Yeah, and beyond the clinical aspects, I think there also needed to be more awareness and education in schools and in communities and just in society in general, to really break down those stigmas and help people understand that this is a real condition and it's not something to be ashamed of.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I think Hyperhidrosis Awareness Kenya they're really on the front lines of this movement. They're advocating for change. They're empowering individuals. Yeah. And it's just really inspiring to see the work that they're doing.
Absolutely. It's fantastic work.
So we've talked about, the systemic changes and the societal stigmas. Yeah. But I think it's also important to remember that behind all of that are real people with real stories and real experiences. Yeah. So in the next part of One Deep Dive, I'd love to hear more about those personal journeys. What are the struggles? What are the triumphs? What are the things that people have learned along the way?
That'd be great.
We've been talking about these big challenges, right? Like the healthcare system and these societal stigmas. Right. But I think it's really important to remember that behind all of that are real people.
Absolutely.
With real stories.
Yeah.
So I'd love to kind of zoom in a little bit and hear more about those individual journeys, for people living with hyperhidrosis in Kenya. Yeah. What are some of the challenges that they face?
Well, just imagine for a second, you're a student and you're taking an exam.
Okay.
You're already stressed out, right? The pressure's on.
Yeah.
And you start to feel that familiar sweat start to build up in your palms.
Oh, yeah.
But it's not just a little bit of perspiration.
Right.
But it's like this full-on sweat storm.
Oh, man.
And your hands are getting slick, and you can barely hold your pen.
Oh, I can't even imagine trying to take an exam like that.
Right.
It would be so distracting.
Exactly.
And it's not just exams, right? It's job interviews, it's social gatherings, it's even simple things like just, holding hands with someone.
Exactly. And those moments could become incredibly challenging for someone with severe hyperhidrosis.
So it really does impact like every aspect of your life.
It really does.
And I imagine that there are people listening who can relate to that.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's so powerful that organizations like Hyperhidrosis Awareness Kenya exist.
Absolutely.
Because they provide that space for people to share their experiences and to connect with others who understand.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have you encountered any stories from the source material that really kind of highlight that resilience?
Yeah, definitely. I remember reading about this young woman who had struggled with hyperhidrosis since she was a child.
Wow.
And, she was bullied in school. She felt really isolated from her peers.
Aww.
And it even impacted her career choices because she was so self-conscious.
I can't even imagine how difficult that must have been.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking.
To have something like that hold you back from pursuing your dreams.
Right.
So what happened to her?
Well, the good news is that she found Hyperhidrosis Awareness Kenya.
Okay.
And through them, she was able to connect with other people who understood what she was going through. She learned about different treatment options, and she really found the courage to advocate for herself.
Wow, so she really turned things around.
She did. And what's really amazing is that she's now using her experience to help others.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, she volunteers with the organization. She shares her story publicly.
That's so inspiring.
Yeah, it's really powerful stuff.
So for anyone listening who might be feeling alone in their struggles, what advice would you give them?
Well, first and foremost, you're not alone.
Yeah.
There are more people out there than you think who are dealing with hyperhidrosis. And there are resources available to help. So
where should they start?
Well, Hyperhidrosis Awareness Kenya is a great place to start.
Okay.
They have a really informative website. They're active on social media. So, reach out, ask questions, find that community that can support you.
And don't be afraid to advocate for yourself.
Exactly.
Learn about your condition, explore different treatment options, and find a doctor who listens to you.
Yeah. Absolutely.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation.
Yeah, it has.
We've covered so much ground today. We talked about the science, we talked about the challenges, the incredible work that Hyperhidrosis Awareness Kenya is doing.
Yeah.
And most importantly, those personal stories.
Absolutely.
That really bring this issue to life.
It's been a privilege to be a part of this conversation.
So if you're interested in learning more or getting involved, be sure to check out Hyperhidrosis Awareness Kenya's website. And until next time, keep diving deep.
You've been listening to The Deep Dive because understanding sweat is the first step to thriving. Remember to subscribe, share, and connect with us on Hyperhidrosis Awareness Kenya's socials. Together, we can stay cool, confident, and unstoppable. Until next time, keep shining. No sweat.